You've got News Munchies with Ted Corliss, and I love to produce a cannabis-positive message in the universe. Not necessarily positive in the sense that I'd like you to smoke more of it, but instead give you an opportunity to have an intelligent conversation with others about the reformation, medicalization, and ultimate legalization of marijuana. Reach out to us at www.newsmunchies.com. It is my pleasure to be with you today and to have this conversation with you. I'm so glad that I have your attention. I want to talk about President Trump's pardons and how they relate to the marijuana question. You'll note that recently this week it was disclosed that President Trump had commuted the sentences of or pardoned a number of federal inmates. I want to begin by addressing the political nature of pardons generally. Then I want to look at some of the individuals that he pardoned because they're very noteworthy and relevant to some of the political issues that we have going on now. And then I want to make some suggestions to President Trump. If that commutation pen is hot, I've got some folks he needs to take care of. Let's talk about the idea of a presidential pardon. For context, the President of the United States, under the conditions contained within our Constitution, has the executive right, without cause or reason, to commute the sentences of any individual currently in the federal system. He cannot commute state sentences, which obviously restricts the nature of the specific crimes that would come into play. It would be doubtful, for example, that someone might have a burglary charge under a federal crime or some kind of vehicular homicide. No, you're not going to see that as a federal crime. But in the 1980s and 90s, in the continued war on drugs that started under the Nixon administration, you saw a lot of individuals being sent to federal prison for drug crimes. And it didn't matter if it was the manufacture of crack cocaine or methamphetamine. It could be anything, including making your own alcohol became a federal crime. Obviously, the manufacturer, as they refer to it, the manufacturer of marijuana is a federal crime. Are there individuals who actually have been charged with and put in federal prison for marijuana? Well, it turns out yes. The individuals we're talking about are people who might be transferring some quantity of drugs over a state line and draw a federal charge. The total number of people, let's just pick out 1 year. Some of the most recent data I was able to grab is 2017. So this was a couple of years ago. But the number of people that year sentenced to federal prison for marijuana possession were 92 people. In addition to that, they were overwhelmingly non-white, even though white people consume cannabis at a much higher clip than people of color or people who describe themselves as Hispanic. This occurred despite the fact that at that point in time, there were more than half of our states had legalized state cannabis. So the feds don't care, and they're continuing to charge people and put them in federal prison for consuming a plant. The other significant problem that marijuana convictions can hit you with on a federal level is anywhere that they have used a form of 3 strikes, you're in. You may recall this began under the Clinton administration, where they determined that any individual who had 3 strikes or 3 felonies would not be permitted to leave prison. You go from whatever your crime was to spending the remainder of your life in prison if you have 3 felonies. And for many of the people in federal or state court and state court or prison, those individuals had at least 1 or more of those charges be associated with simple possession of marijuana. Yet now they're in prison for the balance of their lives. And so that's why this issue, I find it here with me sharing these ideas with you. What about the political nature of these kinds of pardons? You know, I would have to say I describe myself as a social moderate, fiscal conservative. Fiscal conservative means you don't want to waste money. I don't so much describe myself a fiscal conservative that I want to get rid of all of any social benefits and go immediately to giving all the money to large corporations, which is happening pretty consistently now. But the idea here is that most people who describe themselves as conservative in any way, moderate, extreme conservative, as I believe Mitt Romney once described himself as an extreme conservative. It's not just I'm conservative, I'm extreme conservative. Well, most people who describe themselves that way are people who believe in the rule of law. Rules of law that are crimes that people break. And when they break them, they have to go in front of a jury of their peers and defend themselves. And if they don't do it successfully, they go to jail. That's what conservatives like, right? The other thing they like is limited government. And I'd have to say there is nothing less limited government than an executive simply taking a pen and signing their name and releasing people back into the public because they don't like the result that occurred at a jury trial. Now, the political nature of this would then ask, how is it that Donald Trump compares to his predecessors? You would imagine if you went to and walked around looking for people with MAGA hats on and you asked them who's released more criminals from jail, President Trump or President Obama? Well, Obama's not even remotely close to the numbers that he's heading to. In fact, Obama was one of the most limited pardoners, if that's a word, as we've had in a president for some time. President Bush, before him, was previously the governor of Texas. And as a governor in a state that is a big fan of the death penalty, for example, he was not a big fan of commuting sentences from death to life without parole. He usually messaged that he wanted to respect the decision of the community, the decision of the jury, even if it was an unfair result and even if it was the result of an imbalance between the individual who was charged, who might be impoverished, who then had to take on the resources of the state or federal government. And so the idea that anyone could suggest that these kinds of pardons are the result of an individual with a bleeding heart, you've heard that, not so fast, because Mr. Trump's explanation for why he commuted the sentences of some of these individuals could be described as there was no explanation, or the explanation he gave was a bit of a simpleton, which seems to work a lot with him. Let's talk about Michael Milken. Mike Milken was the individual who most people believe was the single-handed strike of the match that created one of the very first bailouts in America. The bailout occurred in the 1990 timeframe, 89-90 timeframe, because things called savings and loans. Remember those? Savings and loan? Or I think if It's a Wonderful Life, building and loan, kind of the same idea here. And there was a statute that created these entities, and they were investment vehicles that Mr. Milken's organization, Drexel Burnham was the name of his securities firm, had used and pumped up a lot of their investments by selling high-risk, high-yield bonds. In fact, they're so high risk, they're even referred to in the industry, and were at that time, as junk bonds, because here's what was going to happen. It's like the scratch-off ticket on steroids. You either just wasted your money or you are loaded. Well, a whole bunch of these contracts failed, which then caused a whole bunch of these savings and loans to crash. And if you happen to be the retired couple that lived down the street from that SNL, you now lost all of your money. And if you didn't have enough protection under FDIC, you ate the losses. And if you think that they're okay because FDIC paid off, you should also know that the FDIC had to pay out $6.8 billion with a B dollars as a result of Mr. Milken and the remainder of the bailout associated with the SNL crash. Now, the reason that's relevant to me is that let's remember one of the real bases that brought Donald Trump to the surface is that he was reaching out to the individuals that described themselves as Tea Party people. And the Tea Party had very much been born out of a disagreement over the United States bailing out the auto industry and a variety of other industries back in 2008 and 2009. You know, when they wrote a check to AIG for $25 billion. Those kinds of bailouts didn't go over very well with the Trump people. And, well, they weren't Trump people yet. They didn't know it. But then when they surrounded him, he built his entire empire, if we want to call it that, on people who were fighting out against big government bailouts. So I'm curious why Mr. Milken, who is in and of himself like a nuclear explosion in the financial markets, why he is worthy of a pardon. I guess because if he lived in the state of Florida, he doesn't. But if he lived here and he's a felon, he doesn't get to vote. Just ask the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people of color in the state of Florida that don't get to vote because they're convicted felons. But Milken is out of prison, and according to Mr. Trump, you know, he was complimenting him because he has created a philanthropy that was giving money to people with cancer. Well, I know a lot of philanthropists out there, and none of them are known admitted criminals. And so, but I guess Mr. Milken gets a pass, and now he gets to vote. And so if I'm complaining that these are the individuals that are getting their sentences commuted, either whether they're in prison or not, or if they're getting released from prison, who is it that I think should be pardoned? Well, I've got two categories that I'm going to propose to you, but first let me introduce one of them. His name is Farrell Scott. Now, Farrell Scott was convicted in 2012 for moving marijuana around over state lines, ends up in Texas. Not a good place to be for you non-law and order fans, but Texas ended up putting him in prison. I don't remember the length of the sentence, but he's in federal prison. Now, Texas has now legalized medical marijuana. And like most of the other states, they're headed towards legalization across the board, if I have anything to say about it. In this context, we have an individual that in 2012 went to prison for doing something that if he did it 5 years later, he wouldn't have been in prison. He would have been on the cover of Fortune magazine. And so these are the individuals who have been crushed by the system, and that's where an executive pardon makes a lot of sense. The other category I want to raise is the idea of the federal death penalty. Okay, well, there are 62 federal death row prisoners right now awaiting the ultimate sentence. Who are they? Well, they're not predominantly white, I'll tell you that much. And as many of the death row opponents that I know, who I support passionately, will tell you, there are no rich men or women on death row, federal, state, or otherwise. And of course, if you look at the list of individuals that Mr. Trump just pardoned, most of them are exactly the opposite of that. They are very wealthy individuals who, if they ended up being convicted or were going to prison, probably had the ability to hire a crackerjack team of lawyers. But these 62 people on federal death row, I would suggest to you, didn't have those resources. They are, again, more than 60% are either African American or self-describe as Hispanic. And only 40% of those individuals are white. So that's the other problem. You're seeing a predominantly white canvas of pardons coming from Mr. Trump. And I guess that doesn't matter to him. The question is then, does it matter to you? Because it matters to me. My belief, my call to action for you now, if you had the reaction that I had when I got up this morning, spent a couple of minutes reading about these pardons, and you feel that fire in your stomach, and you realize, you feel like you got to do something, well, I have the ability to come into this super cool podcast, videocast studio and express my opinions. You might not have that opportunity, but I'm going to tell you something. There is someone you can reach out to. I want you to go online. You need to know who your state and federal representatives are. You know those federal representatives that just acquitted the president of an impeachable offense? If you live in a state where any of those individuals who voted to support President Trump You more than ever need to reach out to those individuals and express your feelings if you believe or agree with the things that I'm describing. And this applies to the cannabis question, death row, or anything. It doesn't matter. If there's something happening in your life that is being affected by these individuals, it's imperative that you reach out to them. And you can find their emails, call them. They keep track of this stuff. They really, really do. They want to get it. And the more people that push back on them, maybe we'll see some change that we can actually accept. We're going to continue to support these ideas, share our thoughts about what's going on in the cannabis community, and look for opportunities where civil liberties are falling behind. Late at night, when you get the munchies, go to www.newsmunchies.com. This is Ted Corliss. Be well.